my name is Rita and thank you for joining us on the first of a series of Aging with Attitude. Even though it is inclusive of all ages, it is specifically applicable to the ages of 45 to 64 age demographic. And we're talking about things that typically don't get talked about a lot. So it's about starting a new conversation. It's far beyond the body, mind, and spirit. And amongst this series, we will address at least 7 different components of healthy aging. They include social, physical, emotional, spiritual, environmental, educational, vocational, all types of things like that. And we may even touch into a few more. Those components of healthy aging are taken from international, national, provincial, and even our own local Aging with Attitude initiative we had here within the past 2 years. So, once we get the conversation started, people want to talk about it, want to talk about all kinds of things. So our guest with us today, I found him very inspirational because he has had good jobs all his life. I've known him for a while, and he was going to retire, and then he decided to go back into the workplace. And so, I'm just curious about what makes a person do that. So with me today, I have John DeGrace. And John, could you just start talking a little bit about why you did that?
Well, it wasn't entirely voluntary. If you go back a few years, I was working for the university as the university registrar and secretary, and the president at the time decided he needed to thin out the ranks and laid off a whole bunch of people. So for the first time in my life, I found myself facing unemployment. I had started out not in university administration, but as a geologist. And at that time, the industry was booming. And so I got in touch with the local Ministry of Mines and found out that they did have an opening for a regional geologist for north central and northeastern BC. And so I threw my hat in that particular ring, was interviewed, got the job. I can still remember thinking, geez, that interview wasn't at all what I thought. And sitting in a rainy cafe in downtown Vancouver, thinking, well, I might as well just take an early flight home and see what else I can find. A couple of days later, I got a call saying, well, we'd like you to come to work with us. Just goes to show that interviews aren't always what you think. In any case, I worked for the ministry for 2.5 years until the university replaced its president. And his replacement got in touch with me after a while. I knew they were having some trouble with their new registrar. And I remember the exact words, come over to my place and have a beer and bring Judy, she and Mary can talk horses, so you can guess which president that was. But anyway, I went over thinking, well, if you expect me to leave a job I like and go back there, fellow, you're going to have to offer me A, B, C, and D. I went over, had a beer pressed into my hand. Before I could open my mouth, he'd offered me A, B, C, and D, and then E and F, which I hadn't even thought of. So I ended up going back to the university. It wasn't the same. I just felt things going sideways and decided I was going to leave, which I did. And joined a local small geological consulting firm, which boomed along until the whole industry fell over a fiscal cliff in 2013. And then I found myself on my own, just taking occasional small contracts wherever I could. I don't know if you might call it semi-retirement, but it was kind of a forced semi-retirement. But I still took these contracts whenever I could, and I enjoyed them. And then in the spring of 2017, my successor as regional geologist resigned to go to work for another firm. And they sat around the office wondering, who can we get? My name came up as somebody who had done the job before, and I took it on as a temporary appointment. We were going to hire a new regional geologist by August. That didn't quite happen, so then it was October. Then it was December. Then, well, we'll interview in January and hire in February. And then it was, let's just skip the whole thing. We'll just move you from temporary to permanent full-time. And they were extremely generous. They said, well, if you need extra time to go and travel, or certain times of the year that are slow, take them if you want a little unpaid leave. At that time, I had some medical issues, which we can talk about if you want. And they were fine with my taking necessary time off to do these things. It is I've heard it called the best office in the provincial government, and I'm inclined to believe that it is. Just an extraordinary group of people. So I have no plans on leaving it right now. They've been so good with me that that engenders a certain amount of loyalty to them.
A few more things that I know about you so far as things that you love to do. One of them you've talked about a little bit about meditation, and another one you're quite involved in the music industry, or you were.
Well, the music industry, is not that I was involved in the industry per se. What happened to me, I saw that the Prince George Symphony Orchestra was, as all symphonies are, having a bit of its own difficulties. And so I was in the office one day buying my season tickets, asked if I could help. It took about 2 days for somebody to call me and say, "We want you on the board." Apparently, being a warm body is good enough. So I served on the board for a few years and then eventually was appointed president. And I stayed on as president until this past spring, June of 2017, when health issues told me, well, it's time to let that go because I don't have time for it. But as for the meditation, I was one of these people who, starting in my 20s and moving on, I'd been fascinated by all these Zen koans and Zen stories and quirky tales and so on. I had a friend who had been practicing meditation for about 15 years, and over lunch one day he said, well, if you really want to know about this stuff, you ought to go and do a retreat. This was 1991, so 27 years ago. And in that year, I decided, all right, I'll do it. Found a teacher that seemed pretty good, signed up for a 9-day silent retreat. This by somebody who had never meditated for 5 minutes in his life. Fortunately, the retreat center was 1,000 kilometers from home, or on day 2 or 3, I might have packed up and driven back. It was very stressful for somebody who was brand new. But by day 4 or 5, I was starting to get what it was about. By the time it was over, I was committed. I've long since lost track of the number of retreats that I've been on. And over time, I gradually, because I'd gained a fair bit of experience, started teaching on my own. So now I teach the Buddhist meditation group in Prince George once a week. And I also, at the request of the person who had to leave Prince George to go back to her mother house, took over from the sister who was leading the Christian meditation group in Prince George. So I don't think of myself as a teacher there so much as a coordinator.
Yeah. So how would you think meditation can help just the average person who maybe is thinking about it? And
it's something you have to keep at. It is doing for the mind what going to the gym does for the body. If you want the body to become stronger, you can take on an exercise program at the gym. You go down, you get a tour of the weight room, you're given a program, and you get started. And you go at least 2 or 3 times a week. And you'll have your good days and your bad days. But what happens is that after a year or so, you look back, and the mind is stronger. It's more one-pointed. It's more an instrument to do what you want. But it required persistence. Same with the gym. You have your good days and your bad days. After a year, you look back and you're lifting more weight. So you simply start and carry on. Simple as that. And if you just go to one meditation sitting, that's like getting a tour of the weight room at the gym. You know what the equipment looks like, but you're not any stronger when it's over.
Can people meditate elsewhere than a meditation group? Can they meditate at home by themselves?
Anybody can meditate at home by themselves. In fact, it's encouraged. But it's really good if you can sit with a group, maybe once a week, or go to a retreat maybe every year or so, because sitting with a group really energizes your practice. It can get a little lonely and frustrated if you're just sitting silently meditating all by yourself day after day. It's encouraging to speak to people who are going through the same experience and to compare notes and learn from each other. So yeah, groups are good.
So something that I'm kind of curious about, being that Christianity is something that most people know something about, what is Buddhist meditation like?
Well, it's actually very much like Christian meditation. People's, no matter what their spiritual background, people's inner experience is the same, essentially. And meditation practices are developed in all the major spiritual traditions. And they use different approaches, different words to talk about it. But the experience of meditation is the same. And so I find working with both Christian and Buddhist meditation is great because I've got 2 separate ways of looking at the same thing, 2 different sets of words, and they really help get the process in the crosshairs for me. Buddhist meditation, like most things, there are a variety of traditions. It's a big tent. The practice that I follow is Theravadan. It's the oldest Buddhist practice. And like all meditation, it begins with a concentration practice, placing the attention on the sensation of the breath, entering and leaving the nostrils. And when the mind wanders off, because the mind is a wild animal for everybody, mind wanders off, you just bring it back. It's like going to the gym, doing 1 rep, with a chest press. You do it over and over and over again, and the mind starts to train itself to stay in one thing. And then once you've partly got it trained, then you broaden out and you start paying attention to other things. The big difference is that Christian meditation is theistic, because there's a God there, and the words that are used to talk about meditation talk about Christ. In Buddhist meditation, it's non-theistic. There's no requirement that you believe in God. So the Buddha's invitation was to his followers, look, this is what I did, and here's what I found. Why don't you try it and see if you find the same thing? So it's almost experimental. It's almost like a science. And yet, the things you learn are the same. And there's a huge amount of dialogue between Christians and Buddhists over meditation, and a lot of parallel thinking.
So that brings me to the whole health issue. Did, when you say you had some health issues earlier on, did meditation help you get through that?
It did. One of the reasons I started meditating was, this was years and years ago, I was just reading about it. And I had an episode of kidney stones, which are very painful. And at the time, I was stuck alone. And I remembered what I had read, that instead of just sitting there feeling averse, just hating the whole experience, what I could do is turn my attention to it and explore that. And I found that when I stopped feeling irritated or upset or angry about it and started looking at it carefully, it became a whole lot easier. It's much the same with meditation. I only had 2 significant surgeries in my life, leaving aside tonsillectomy at age 5. I had to have a deviated septum repaired. And at that time, I'd been meditating for about 15 years. And I thought, I will just see if I can train myself to pay as much attention as possible to what it's like to go under a general anesthetic. And then, just as you can sort of train yourself to wake up a minute before the alarm goes off, see if I can be really attentive to what it's like to regain consciousness. That was absolutely fascinating. And yeah, it works very nicely. And with modern anesthetics, losing consciousness is kind of fun. But my most recent one was a comparative biggie. I was diagnosed with this is a little less than a year ago, with a really aggressive prostate cancer that required what's called a radical prostatectomy. It had to come out. And that required a lot more anesthetic, and the mind was a lot more muddled coming out. But I found that when I did come out of the anesthetic, I was able to take a meditative approach, much as I'd done years before, be attentive to it, and it was okay. I won't pretend it was pleasant. There wasn't a lot of pain, but, 2.5 weeks on a catheter is not fun. And then following that, and I was able to use a meditative approach much more easily, we did some follow-up radiation therapy, 33 episodes. And there, you're lying still, you might as well meditate, might as well pay attention to the breath. And so that's what was done most days. And that's all behind me now, so now we're in recuperation mode.
That's most interesting. I find that, just with the things that you've done, the focus you've put on them, you've lived a very full life. And
in the health part, though, it helped that I spent a large part of my life walking, either because I wanted to or for a living. And for almost 20 years before this last episode, working out at the gym. And my family doctor and my specialist both say that was a real contributor to a rapid recovery.
So just to sort of, sum some things up that we've talked about so far, if you were able to give your 45-year-old self some advice, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, I can do better than that because I've got 2 sons, both in their early 40s, so I'll talk about what advice I'd give them. But maybe I'll tell you that, and then I'll contrast it with the advice I got from my father. I would tell my 2 sons, because they both have good, steady jobs with lots of benefits and everything else, that you'll probably find that you reach the point where you're not getting satisfied by the work you're doing anymore, and you want to change. And my advice would be, don't quit. You're in a position now where you can start from a position of strength, and you can look around carefully to see what's out there that you might like to do better. And I'd further tell them, don't typecast yourself. My older son is an analytical chemist. So don't tell yourself, I'm that and I have to have a job in analytical chemistry. My younger son works as a project manager for the National Research Council. Don't tell yourself I'm a project manager and I have to do that. Just start looking and see if something looks really interesting and say to yourself, you know what, I could do that. And then if you feel you could do it and you'd enjoy it, go ahead and apply. And you'll find that even though you come from a somewhat different background, most employers will look carefully at you if you present yourself well. And that's what happened to me throughout my career. I did a number of very different things. So I don't want my sons to have any interruption between employment. Make it seamless. Take your time and make it seamless, and don't prejudge yourself. Now, my father, in advising the 5 of us children, came from a whole different generation. They were children of the Depression, where if you got a job, you hung on to it for dear life. And I know he didn't always enjoy his work, but he did more or less that. He had maybe 2 jobs after graduation for his whole life. And he would tell his children, do that. Get a job, stick with it, it's safe. And he advised his children to have what he called a fallback job. So the girls were all supposed to train to be secretaries, and the boys were all supposed to be trained to be barbers. None of us did that. And we all followed a more modern career path of changing around quite a bit. But times certainly have changed, and my sons might well advise their children something entirely different because they grew up well in an age of social media, which we didn't.
So, John, you talked about the advice to your sons that you gave, and what was the process of your career? How did it evolve?
It more or less followed that advice. I mean, I went to university with the idea that I was going to do engineering mathematics, and about 2 weeks in, I realized that university math was nothing like high school math, and I wasn't any good at it, and I didn't really enjoy it. But I had this compulsory geology course, and I remember sitting in the lecture theater, fascinated, thinking back to when the other kids were all going out to play baseball and I was out behind the school with a hammer hitting limestone to see if I could find fossils. It just never occurred to me you could get paid for stuff like that. So I went on and did my undergraduate and then my graduate work in geology. And then at the time I was in Newfoundland, so I went to work for the Newfoundland Geological Survey. Then a little time in consulting. Like a lot of people in Newfoundland, I was driven out by the economy. And I saw an ad in the Northern Miner newspaper for a research officer for the Library of Parliament in Ottawa to work with MPs and senators and committees on mining and energy and the earth sciences. And I thought, well, I can do that. So I applied. Much to my surprise, I got an interview, was flown down, in at 4:30 in the morning one day, out at 7 o'clock that night. And I remember sitting in the bar at the Labrador Inn with my senior assistant when the phone rang at the bar, and it was the House of Commons offering me the job. So I went and had an absolutely fascinating time. But what I found was that this was work that if you stayed at it too long would leave you really not equipped to do anything else. It was very different, very specialized parliamentary research. So I missed the East. At that time we were in the depths of the 1980 recession. The only job anywhere was as Director of Energy and Minerals for the provincial government in Prince Edward Island. I remember thinking, well, I can do that. So I applied. They flew me down, and sure enough, I got that job. I stayed with that for 4 or 5 years. I forget exactly how many, but public service life in PEI is extremely political. It's such a small province. And I found it increasingly an awkward place to be working. And so I followed my advice to my sons and started looking around, knowing that there were no other, ministerial positions out there. And I saw something with the University of Prince Edward Island. They were looking at a director of research development. And I remember thinking, well, I can do that because I've done research. So I applied, damned if I didn't get the job. I stayed with that for 6 years. Until I felt I'd done a lot of what I could with the resources I had. And the position of registrar at that university came up. Well, I thought, well, I already know the research side of a university, the scholarly activity, but I don't know the student side. So I applied to be registrar. Thought I could probably do it. Darned if I didn't get the job. So I stayed at that for 10 years. And in my 10th year, I felt I'd done 90% of what I could do with the resources I had, and I started getting these calls from a headhunter in Vancouver. And the headhunter in Vancouver wanted me to come out and work in a place called the University of Northern BC, which I'd never heard of. Didn't know anything about Prince George except for the stories about crosses burning on the lawns. And I got a call about every 4 months. And finally, after a year of this, I said, look, this doesn't make any economic sense. I said, for one thing, my wife has a job that she really likes here at this university, and unless there was something for her, I'd rather this not go any further. They said, well, what does she do? I said, well, she's a research technician working in the field of pharmacogenetics. They said, oh, did you know we're opening a medical school? Well, I didn't know. So finally, I sent off what I think of as the kiss of death resume, my best effort, plus Judy's resume, with a letter saying, with respect, unless you're prepared to fly us both out, interview us both, offer us both positions, I'd rather this not go any further. Damned if they didn't fly us out, interview us both, offer us both positions, and so on we came. We've been here ever since. It's been going on 16 years now. We have no plans to go anywhere. And so I started my career at UNBC, and I think earlier I referenced the progression from there, but through this whole series of jobs, they've been sometimes very different from one another, but they've always been interesting. They've always been things that I kept a completely open mind about what I could do, what might be fun, and I don't regret any of it. And now I'm back as a geologist, having left that kind of geology back years ago. So now that I'm back here, it's all fresh again. And so I'm not going anywhere.
Well, the careful consideration of all those things to be done work-wise in today's society, where oftentimes people have several marriages. I'll just talk for personal experience. I find that that can really set a person back. Just going through divorces and that sort of thing. Do you have anything to comment about that?
Well, I'm on marriage number 2. They say that divorce is the most expensive single decision a person can make, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. My wife Judy and I married both at roughly the age of 50. Neither of us had any savings at that point, but we did have pension plans, so that was a start. And we started at that point putting away as much as we could, as quickly as we could. So when it came time to what you might call normal retirement age, whatever that is, we both had enough to get by on. I had a couple of different pension plans rolled together, plus a defined contribution plan from the university up the hill here, plus outside the envelope investments, and we were able to draw on those. My wife had a decent pension plan from the university in Prince Edward Island where we were. So what we found at roughly that age is that we were able to get along okay on what we had. The house was paid for, the cars were paid for, it was just surviving. But I kept on doing contract work, and partly because I enjoyed it, and partly because our basic income took care of our day-to-day living expenses. But the work-related income took care of Judy's horse, took care of home renos, took care of travel, because our families are all back east. And it's worked out quite well.
So I see you sort of rolled the financial thing into the financial component into this conversation as well. So that's great. I mean, that's something that sometimes we don't want to talk about, and
well, everybody's different.
Yes, exactly. So before we do wind up here, is there anything else that you can think of that you would like people out there, say between 60, younger than 65 or older than 65, to know?
Well, Rita, I'm 71, so I'm outside your particular envelope. Most people, I think, if they look after themselves reasonably well, and I've had some health challenges and I'm still feeling pretty chipper, are able to go on for a nice while. So I don't think, and I don't think anybody does in this age, think of retirement as a mandatory step. I think what people do is they carry on until they feel, for their own good reasons, that they want to stop working, whether full-time or doing contract work, and then they do. So if retirement exists, and I'm inclined to think it does, frankly, it's entirely a voluntary process. It's not this wall that people used to have to face where they were retired by their employer even if they didn't want to, even if they had plenty of energy and wanted to continue. This day and age, people just carry on. I'm not sure that the so-called Freedom 55 set even exists anymore. I think people are finding more and more that they need to keep working. And my attitude is that, and it was the advice to my sons, is keep doing stuff that you really enjoy so that you don't end up resigning out of just frustration and tiredness.
Mm-hmm. And staying engaged in society, what's your feeling on that?
Well, I think I mentioned I resigned as president of the symphony because of the health issue, but I've carried on with the board. I'm very active with them, very active with my meditation groups. Mm-hmm. I do all kinds of different volunteer things through the run of a year.
So if somebody were to consider meditation, how would they contact the meditation group?
We have a website. I'm just trying to remember the title, but if you Google Meditation Prince George, that site will come up very easily, and it will give our location and times. And anybody is welcome, for either the Christian or the Buddhist group, to simply show up, and we'll offer instruction and get them started. And I can tell you from experience, for people that are interested in doing that, there's a majority of people that will show up once and leave thinking to themselves, okay, did that, bought the t-shirt, and you'll never see them again. Then you get people that will come, this sort of echoes the Christian parable of the sower and the seeds, I guess. You get people who will show up a few times and then you never see them again. They maybe got all they wanted out of it. You'll see people who will be away for months and they'll miss it and say, yeah, I want that, and they'll come back and stay. And a very few people that show up, stay, and never leave. They're committed to the practice. So we're all different, and my attitude is anybody who wants to show up and get the metaphorical tour of the weight room, you can't lose. At least you know what the weight room looks like. At least you know a little bit about what meditation is about. You've dipped your toe in that water.
Excellent analogy. So I just want to take a few minutes to wrap it up, to thank John for joining us and sharing his wisdom. Just invite people to keep an eye on your channel and watch for the next guests that we do have, and we do have a few of them booked. So I'm Rita Wiebe, and thank you for joining us on starting the new conversation around aging with attitude.